Imagine boarding a plane, settling into your seat, and minding your own business, only to have a complete stranger demand your removal, simply because of the color of your skin. That's exactly what happened when a racist passenger tried to have a black man kicked off the flight, convinced he didn't belong in first class. She called security, certain she had won. But the moment he reached into his jacket and pulled out his FBI badge, everything changed. What happened next left the entire plane in stunned silence. The airport buzzed with the usual chaos. Boarding announcements crackling over the speakers, suitcases rolling across the polished floor, and impatient passengers sighing as they waited in long lines. At Gate 27, a flight bound for Washington, D.C., was preparing for boarding. The tension was barely noticeable at first, just an undercurrent in the air. But something was about to shift. A tall black man in a navy blue suit approached the boarding area, carrying only a sleek black leather bag. He walked with quiet confidence, his posture straight, his expression unreadable. He handed his boarding pass to the attendant, who smiled and nodded him through. But as he stepped forward, a woman in an expensive beige coat and pearl earrings, standing just behind him in line, suddenly stiffened. She was in her mid-50s, her blonde hair immaculately styled, her lips pursed in clear disapproval. She clutched the handle of her designer carry-on, her knuckles whitening. At first, she said nothing, but her gaze lingered on the man's back, suspicion flickering in her eyes. When she finally spoke, it was just loud enough for the people around her to hear. "Excuse me, miss," she addressed the gate agent, "but shouldn't there be some sort of security screening before letting everyone on board?" The agent, taken aback, glanced at her. "Ma'am, all passengers have already been screened before entering the terminal." The woman made a show of adjusting her coat. "Yes, well, I just find it concerning that some people are getting on this flight without further checks." She turned her eyes pointedly toward the black man, who was now settling into his first-class seat. The gate agent hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "All passengers go through the same TSA screening, ma'am. There's no additional process." The woman scoffed, her voice sharper now. "I just don't feel safe. You never know these days." A few people in line shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances. A younger woman with a laptop bag muttered something under her breath, shaking her head. But before anyone could intervene, the woman marched past the agent and strode onto the plane. The moment she entered the first-class cabin, her eyes locked onto the black man again. He was seated near the window, adjusting his wristwatch, seemingly unbothered by her scrutiny. She inhaled sharply and turned to a flight attendant. "I need to speak to the captain immediately," she demanded. The flight attendant blinked, startled. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" "Yes, there's a problem." The woman's voice rose slightly. "That man," she pointed an accusatory finger. "He doesn't belong in first class. I know for a fact that people like him don't normally sit up here." The cabin fell silent. A businessman a few rows ahead stopped typing on his laptop. A young couple exchanging travel plans paused mid-conversation. Even the flight attendants seemed frozen, caught between protocol and the growing tension. The black man finally looked up. His dark eyes met the woman's, steady and unreadable. But he said nothing. The flight attendant's face turned red with embarrassment. "Ma'am, all passengers in this cabin have paid for their seats." "I doubt that," the woman sneered. "I've seen this before. Some people slip through the cracks. You should check his ticket." A younger man, a few rows back, let out an incredulous laugh. "Lady, what century are you living in?" The woman ignored him. She squared her shoulders and glared at the flight attendant. "Either you check his credentials, or I'm calling security myself." By now, whispers had spread throughout the first-class cabin. The flight attendant, clearly flustered, turned hesitantly to the man. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but could I see your boarding pass?" The black man exhaled slowly, as if considering whether to respond. Then he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out not just his boarding pass, but a sleek, leather-bound wallet. With deliberate slowness, he flipped it open. The gold letters gleamed under the cabin lights. FBI. The woman's face drained of color. A hush fell over the cabin as passengers leaned in, realizing what had just happened. Even the flight attendants exchanged wide-eyed glances. The black man's voice was quiet, controlled. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" The woman's mouth opened, but no words came out. She stepped back as if she had just touched something scalding. The flight attendants swallowed hard. "I am so sorry, sir. I had no idea." The man didn't break eye contact with the woman. "No need to apologize," he said, his tone still calm but carrying weight. "Though I do wonder what exactly made her feel unsafe." The woman's hands trembled slightly as she clutched her coat. I didn't." The businessman, who had been typing, let out a low whistle. "Well, this just got awkward." Someone snickered in the back. The woman's face burned red with humiliation. She turned sharply toward the flight attendant. I need to be moved." "I refuse to sit near him." Before the flight attendant could respond, the black man leaned back in his seat, his badge still visible. "That won't be necessary," he said smoothly. "I believe she's about to remove herself." The woman's eyes flickered with panic. A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. A man in a baseball cap muttered, "You messed with the wrong guy, lady." The flight attendant straightened. "Ma'am, if you're uncomfortable, you're welcome to switch to economy, if there's an available seat." The woman let out a strangled noise, somewhere between a gasp and a huff. I will be filing a complaint," she stammered, but her confidence had cracked. The black man finally closed his wallet and tucked it away. "Please do. In fact, let me give you the direct number for the Bureau's complaints department. I'd be very interested to hear what you have to say." The woman swallowed hard. Without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed down the aisle, past the amused and disapproving faces of other passengers. The flight attendant cleared her throat, regaining composure. If everyone could please take their seats, we'll be taking off shortly." As the passengers settled in, the black man turned back to his window, as though nothing had happened. The businessman, too, rose, a head chuckled. That was better than in-flight entertainment. The young woman with a laptop bag leaned forward. "Sir, that was legendary." The man only gave a small, knowing smile. Somewhere in the back of the plane, the woman's angry muttering continued. But no one was listening anymore. The plane hummed with a quiet energy as passengers settled in. Conversations resumed, but the tension from the earlier confrontation still lingered in the air like an echo. Some passengers stole quick glances at the black man, their eyes filled with admiration, respect, or curiosity. Others shook their heads in disbelief at the woman's audacity. She was now seated in economy, her posture rigid, her face still flushed from the humiliation. She clutched her purse tightly, knuckles white, her mind racing. She had never been spoken to like that before, never been put in her place so publicly. It made her stomach twist. A flight attendant approached, holding a glass of water. "Ma'am, would you like something to drink?" The woman barely acknowledged her, waving her off with a sharp shake of her head. Her thoughts were elsewhere. She wanted revenge. Her fingers twitched as she reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her phone. She turned it on, her mind already crafting the story she would tell. She would say she felt unsafe, that a man had flashed a badge but refused to answer questions, that something about him didn't feel right, that she was just a concerned citizen doing her duty. She opened a blank email, her fingers flying over the keyboard. To TSA Security. Subject: urgent concern about suspicious passenger. Her lips curled slightly as she typed. This wasn't over. Meanwhile, in first class, the black man sat back in his seat, adjusting his tie. He could still feel the weight of eyes on him, but he was used to that. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his presence in a space like this. It wouldn't be the last. A deep, rumbling voice broke the silence. That was something else. The black man turned his head slightly. The businessman 2 seats away, gray hair, sharp suit, expensive watch, was watching him with a smirk. You handled that better than most would have. The black man offered a small nod. Wasn't the first time. Won't be the last. The businessman chuckled. Yeah, but flashing that badge? That was like a movie scene. Should have seen her face. He leaned in slightly. FBI, huh? The black man's expression remained neutral. Something like that. The businessman studied him for a moment, then gave a knowing nod. Well, you've got my respect. Name's Richard. The black man hesitated, then extended his hand. James. Richard shook it firmly. Pleasure. What takes you to D.C., James? James gave a half-smile. Work. Richard chuckled again. I figured. He paused, glancing toward the curtain separating first class from the rest of the plane. You know she's not done, right? James didn't react. He simply exhaled slowly. I know. Richard leaned back. I'd watch my back if I were you. People like that, they don't like to lose. James didn't need the warning. He'd dealt with this kind of person before, entitled, vindictive, unable to accept that they were wrong. He had a feeling she wasn't going to let this go quietly. The flight attendants began moving through the aisles, preparing for takeoff. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the flight time and expected weather conditions. James closed his eyes for a moment, mentally preparing himself. This was supposed to be a simple flight. Now, it felt like something more. 30 minutes into the flight. The seatbelt sign blinked off, and the flight attendants started their service. The air was calmer now, but there was still an underlying tension. James sensed something before he saw it. A shift. A presence. Then, a flight attendant hesitantly approached his seat. A different one from earlier. She looked nervous. Sir, she said softly. James opened his eyes and looked at her. I'm really sorry to bother you, but the captain needs to speak with you. James's jaw tightened slightly. The captain. She nodded, her voice hushed. He received a security concern about you. James was still for a moment. Then he sighed. Let me guess. From the woman in economy. The flight attendant's face reddened, but she didn't confirm it. She didn't need to. James unbuckled his seatbelt and stood. The first-class cabin watched as he calmly followed the flight attendant toward the front of the plane. Richard's gaze followed him, his expression unreadable. As James stepped into the small, restricted area near the cockpit, the captain stood waiting, arms crossed. He was in his late 40s, with graying hair and a stiff posture. Beside him stood the head flight attendant and another crew member. The captain sighed. Sir, I apologize for this, but we received a report about you. James kept his face neutral. Let me guess. A passenger felt unsafe? The captain nodded, rubbing his temple. She claims you presented a badge, but when she asked questions, you refused to answer them. She said your behavior was suspicious, and that she believes you may not be who you say you are. James held back a humorless chuckle. And what do you believe, Captain? The captain hesitated. I believe this is a misunderstanding, but I have to follow protocol. James reached into his pocket, retrieving his wallet again. He flipped it open, revealing the badge and identification card. The captain inspected it closely, then nodded. I figured as much. But the problem is, she's insisting we contact airport security upon landing. James let out a slow breath. Of course she is. The head flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. She's making a scene back there. Other passengers are getting upset. She's saying she won't feel safe unless something is done. James closed his badge and slipped it back into his pocket. Captain, let me ask you something. If I were a white man sitting in first class, would we be having this conversation? The captain's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. James nodded. Thought so. The captain cleared his throat. Listen, I don't like this any more than you do, but I have to keep order on my plane. I'll handle her when we land. But for now, I'd appreciate it if you just remained seated and let me deal with her. James studied the captain for a long moment, then nodded. Fair enough. He turned and walked back to his seat, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on him. As he passed the economy section, he caught sight of her. The woman was sitting upright, her phone in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line of victory. James met her gaze briefly. She smirked. She thinks she's won. James said nothing. He simply walked past her, back to his seat. Richard arched an eyebrow as James sat down. That bad? James exhaled. She reported me to security. They'll be waiting when we land. Richard let out a low whistle. Wow. She really doesn't know when to quit. James nodded. but neither do I. Richard grinned. Now that's what I like to hear. James leaned back, staring out the window. He had a feeling this flight was only the beginning. James exhaled slowly, watching the clouds stretch endlessly outside the small oval window. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest, not out of nervousness, but out of the quiet frustration that simmered beneath his calm exterior. This wasn't new. This wasn't shocking. But it was still infuriating. He had spent years dealing with people like that woman, people who masked their prejudice behind the veil of concern or security. People who couldn't fathom the idea that a black man could be in a position of authority, let alone occupy a first-class seat. And now, she thought she had one, thought she had placed a target on his back. But she had no idea who she was dealing with. Richard cleared his throat beside him, shifting slightly in his seat. "You know," he murmured, leaning in so only James could hear, "I've seen things like this before. Maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. It always plays out the same way. The people who make the most noise? They usually end up embarrassing themselves." James smirked slightly, though there was little humor in it. "She's already embarrassed herself. She just doesn't realize it yet." Richard chuckled. "Yeah, but I think she's about to get a real wake-up call." James didn't respond, but he appreciated the sentiment. His mind was already 10 steps ahead, calculating the best way to handle what was waiting for him when the plane landed. The way he saw it, he had two choices. He could let security detain him and go through the motions, proving his identity for the second time in one day, or he could take control of the situation before it even got to that point. He preferred the latter. The flight continued on, the tension still hanging in the air like an unspoken challenge. Every so often, James could feel the woman's eyes on him, like she was waiting for him to make a mistake, waiting for him to slip up so she could justify the ridiculous accusations she had thrown his way. But he never did. He sat still, calm, unbothered, because he knew something she didn't. He was in control. When the final announcement came over the intercom, instructing passengers to prepare for landing, James adjusted his tie and sat up straighter. He caught a glimpse of the woman in economy, watching as she smoothed down her blouse, her expression filled with satisfaction. She thought she had won. That was her first mistake. As the plane touched down, the familiar jolt of wheels meeting the runway, sending a slight tremor through the cabin, James remained motionless. Around him, passengers began shifting, unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching, reaching for their bags. The flight attendants moved with swift efficiency, preparing for disembarkation. The air was thick with anticipation, and James could feel the energy shift the moment the woman stood up, craning her neck as if trying to catch sight of whatever security presence she had managed to summon. She looked smug, too smug. James had seen that look before, entitlement wrapped in the belief that she was untouchable, that she was the hero in this twisted little narrative she had built in her head. And then the door opened. 2 uniformed airport security officers stepped onto the plane, their presence immediately drawing attention. Passengers whispered, eyes darting between them and the first-class section. The woman's smirk widened, her posture straightening with self-importance. She turned toward them, lifting a perfectly manicured hand and waving them forward, as if she had just called in a favor. "There," she said, her voice ringing out, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. "That's him." The words echoed, slicing through the cabin like a blade. The officers followed her gaze, their expressions unreadable as they locked onto James. He remained seated, expression neutral, unreadable, just watching. He could feel Richard tense beside him, could hear the slight murmurs from the surrounding passengers. The lead officer, a tall man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Sir, we need you to come with us." James didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch, let the silence thicken until it was almost unbearable. He wanted her to feel the weight of what was about to happen. Then slowly, deliberately, he reached into his suit jacket and pulled out his badge. The reaction was immediate. The officers hesitated, their postures shifting as realization dawned. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, a ripple of shock spreading through the passengers. The woman's smile faltered, her confidence cracking as she watched the officers' faces change. James held the badge up, his voice steady. "I'm Special Agent James Carter, FBI." He let the words sink in before adding, "And I'd like to know why you're attempting to detain a federal agent on the baseless accusations of a passenger with a personal vendetta." The lead officer blinked, clearly thrown off. He glanced at his partner, then back at James. "We were told." "You were told," James cut in smoothly, "by a woman who felt entitled enough to demand I be removed from this flight because she didn't like where I was sitting." His gaze flickered to the woman, who was now stiff, her hands gripping the strap of her purse, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "So tell me, officer, is this how security works these days? Are we just detaining people based on the whims of angry, prejudiced passengers?" The officer's jaw tightened. "Sir, we didn't know." "You didn't know because you didn't check," James interjected, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made the officer flinch. "You walked onto this plane with the assumption that I was guilty of something. You didn't verify. You didn't question. You just took her word for it." The woman let out a nervous laugh, stepping forward. I was just trying to be careful," she stammered, her confidence unraveling before everyone's eyes. "I mean, you wouldn't answer my questions, and I thought." "You thought you could get rid of me," James finished for her. "You thought you could humiliate me, strip me of my dignity, and walk away feeling like you'd won something." He tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. "But tell me, ma'am, do you still feel like a winner?" The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her face had gone pale, her hands trembling at her sides. James turned back to the officers. "If I were you, I'd reconsider how you handle reports like these in the future. Because right now, you're dangerously close to violating the rights of a federal agent over a lie." The officers exchanged glances, then stepped back. The lead officer cleared his throat, straightening. "Apologies, Agent Carter. We were misinformed." James slid his badge back into his jacket, his expression unreadable. That's an understatement. Passengers were watching in stunned silence. Some looked satisfied. Others looked furious, furious at the woman, furious at the injustice of it all. Richard, meanwhile, was grinning like a man who had just watched his favorite team win the championship. As the officers turned to leave, the woman remained frozen in place. It was over. She had lost. And the entire plane had seen it. James stood up, gathering his carry-on. He didn't say another word to her. He didn't need to. The silence between them spoke volumes. As he walked past her, he caught one last glimpse of her expression. Shock, humiliation, and something else. Fear. James smirked. "Have a nice day, ma'am." Then, without looking back, he stepped off the plane, walking straight into the airport, where his real work awaited him.